Unlike my colleagues, my research doesn't make for good cocktail conversation. You see, I work with women who have been accused of abusing their children, women who are prostituting and or who have been sex trafficked. Inevitably, when I'm at one of these parties or talking about my work, the conversation somehow digresses into blaming the women for their life circumstances, and usually ends with the suggestion that these women's lives would be so much better if they just made better choices. Rather than lecturing people about the inadequacies of our social service system, or talking about how the confluence of racism, sexism, classism contribute to the complexity of these women's lives, I simply smile and say it's more complicated than that. The last time I found myself in one of these conversations, I began to really think about this idea of choice. And would their lives be much better if they made better choices? And what I realized was that people who have an array of choices often don't think about what it's like for someone whose choices are limited. People who have an array of choices never really consider the possibility that people could be choosing between two bad things or have two bad choices. See, for many of us, the choices center around which job we should take, which job will provide the most advancement or financial gain, which part of the city do we want to live in, which car to buy, which house to buy. And so we make those decisions based on what's important to us at the time. But what happens for people what happens when none of someone's choices are ideal? How do they choose? And so I want to introduce you to Paula, one of the many women who've participated in my research. Paula is a 26-year-old African-American woman, mother of 6, the youngest of 10 siblings. Paula grew up in a home that was very abusive. Her father was a heavy drinker, and she talked about hiding in the closet with her siblings when her father went on one of his rampages, which was almost nightly. She talked about the fear of constantly never knowing when her father was going to go off, never knowing what was going to set him off. She remembered being awakened out of her sleep when she was about 5, and her mom and her siblings escaping from the house. That was the last time Paula saw her father. They essentially were homeless. They left with the clothes on their back, had no money. Mom was a stay-at-home mom, had no basic skills. Ended up at a shelter, and this shelter was a 30-day shelter that they had 30 days to basically get housing. After 30 days, they had to leave the shelter. And Paula's mom did her best to keep her family together, and so stayed anywhere that could accommodate a family of 11. After months and months of trying to establish herself, decided that she needed to move closer to family. She moved from Chicago back to Milwaukee to be closer to extended family, and went to live with her father and her brothers. Paula moved to one of the poorest, most crime-ridden parts of Milwaukee. In this community, over 50% of households have incomes below the poverty line. Less than 60% of the young people in this community graduate. Paula's mom worked 2 jobs to try to make ends meet, but was still unable to live independently. While Paula's mom was at work, Paula's grandfather and uncles routinely sexually and physically abused her. This went on from the age of 5 to 14, when Paula finally ran away from home. Paula's uncles and grandfather threatened that if she told anyone, her family would be homeless. Not wanting to be homeless again, Paula said nothing. Instead, Paula started getting in trouble at school, started getting into fights. By the 9th grade, she had dropped out of school. She had been expelled from 2 schools and had been suspended more times than she could count. One of the things that struck me when I was talking to her was that she said the schools in her neighborhood had given up on her long before she gave up on them. And I asked her, what did she mean by that? And she said that no one knew of the secret that she was keeping. And no one bothered to see past her anger, past her aggressive behavior, to see what was really happening and going on with her. She's 14, she decides that she's gonna start selling drugs to make money. Quickly decided that was not a good idea, and instead decided that she was going to sleep with drug dealers for money instead. Her first boyfriend was a 39-year-old drug dealer who ended up getting her hooked on heroin and crack cocaine. She had her first child, Tina, at the age of 15. And she talked about getting pregnant pretty much every year after that, because when she was pregnant, he didn't beat her as much. Paula loved this man. And she said she loved him because he was the first person that really took care of her. So when he asked her to sleep with his friends and then complete strangers, she did it because she loved him. She didn't begin to doubt his love for her until she had her son Miles. And shortly after having her son Miles, not to be graphic, but stitches, still sore from giving birth, made to sleep with men. At one point, she was sleeping with 10 to 15 men a night. Paula didn't consider herself to be sex trafficked because she said she could leave at any time. The thing was that she couldn't take her children with her. And since there was no way that she was leaving her children behind, she stayed. After years of being sex trafficked, she finally was arrested for prostitution and drug possession. Ended up doing 2 years in prison, and that's actually how she escaped from him. After getting out of jail, went to live with her mother, who was caring for her 5 children at the time. To help out, she decided to go back to prostituting, or decided to prostitute. While being prostituted or out there prostituting, she was raped repeatedly. On one of the last times that she remembered being raped, it was so violent that she was sodomized and beat so badly that she was hospitalized. Her daughter, Andrea, is a product of that rape. She had been involved with child protection at many different points, mostly because she had given birth to substance-exposed infants. It wasn't that she didn't try to stop using drugs while she was pregnant, but she said that drugs was the only thing that helped her cope with all the things that had been done to her and all the things that she had done. And so she was in and out of prison, in and out of jail. I finally met her at a drug treatment center. She had lost custody of all of her children, except for her youngest daughter, Andrea, who she was fighting to get custody or regain custody of. She desperately wanted a chance to raise one of her children. So we talk about Save Our City, we talk about choices. Let's look at the choices that Paula had. We're talking about Paula's mom had a choice to stay in an abusive marriage with her 10 children or leave and leave all her belongings behind and essentially be homeless. Paula had the choice to tell her mom what was happening to her and risk she had the choice to tell her mom what was happening or remain silent and ensure that her family had a place to live. Paula had the choice to remain in a home where she was being physically and sexually abused, or go live with a 39-year-old drug dealer who was pimping her out for money. She had the choice to remain sober and face all the abuse that she had experienced, or to continue to numb the pain. Which was the best choice? Which would you choose? In my research with women who have been traumatized women from marginalized communities, we think about this idea of choice, that they make choices differently than people who don't have these backgrounds. Typically, their choices are made based on whatever's going to cause them the least amount of pain and or meet an immediate need. The trouble with choosing choices based on pain and immediate need is that they often do alleviate the pain in the short term, but the consequences long term are dire. For example, selling drugs meets an immediate need for money. The long-term consequences of that, there's usually jail or death. Going back to Paula, using drugs did meet an immediate need for numbing out, for getting the pain. The long-term consequence of that choice was losing custody of her children. And so when we oftentimes hear people talk about feeling like they don't have any choice, when you think about people who have two bad choices, it can feel a lot like that. Psychologist Barry Schwartz said, for people who have no choice, life is almost unbearable. As we increase their choices, we increase their autonomy, control, and liberation. And so the question becomes, how do we increase Paula's choices? First, we fund a social service system that meets the needs of individuals like Paula. We provide long-term housing options and support. It's not that we don't have shelters, but many of them are 30 to 90 days. And with people who have complex histories like Paula, they often need much, much longer than that. In addition, many of these shelters require people to leave during the day. Okay, where do you go during the day? They often don't provide the kinds of services that women like Paula need: substance abuse treatment, mental health, job skills. And so again, I recognize that this is an expensive option that we're talking about and funding these programs, but to house Paula in Wisconsin jails, $30,000 a year. For a child in foster care, one of Paula's children in foster care is over $400 a day. And so again, this is just not just about money. This is also about the fact that how do we create communities, families, societies that are safe and healthier. This is about the fact that if we don't help Paula and we don't help Paula's children, that we will be serving Paula's children 5, 10, 20 years from now, who will then be the adults. And so we know that there are intergenerational effects of poverty. We know there are intergenerational effects of trauma. And so my question is that we can either pay now or we can pay later, but we pay. And so why not have something to show for our investment? Second, trauma. Helping professionals, social workers, teachers, other helping professionals need to understand more about trauma and the ways in which it shows up in women's lives. Again, it's not just about that, but it's that and then creating trauma-informed systems of care. Trauma-informed systems of care not only think about and recognize trauma that are in these women's lives, but also we change systems to become responsive to that. And Paula talked a lot about the fact that, again, she did not feel that she could say anything because of the thought of her family being homeless, but she went to school hoping that someone would notice what was happening, that someone would see a change in her and know that something was happening to her. Again, I submit to you that 6-year-olds who are coming to school angry and aggressive and acting out, they're not doing that for no reason. And so again, how do we begin to pay attention to our children, to people who are hurting in our society? What are we doing? It's not that Paula's without a part in this. Paula has the task of trying to make the best choices that she has, given her available choices at any given time. And I just shared a little bit of Paula's story with you, but there were many more things that had happened to Paula through the course of her life. So what's the take-home message? People who have histories of trauma, in terms of choices, their choices are constrained by life circumstances. That people make choices that make sense to them. People's choices make sense to them. Again, oftentimes all we see is the end result, right? We see them in jail, but we don't understand the things that led to that. When we have communities that have no jobs, when we have communities where people can't get transportation to where the jobs are, people are left with limited choices. And what does that create? That people who have these histories, marginalized populations and segments of our population, make choices differently. And again, if you think about it, it's a rational choice to make a choice based on what's going to cause me the least amount of pain. Many of these people are hurting so badly that they just want to stop hurting. And so making a choice based on pain makes a lot of sense. And so, again, finally, I think the last point that I want to make is that oftentimes I feel like with this population, we sometimes, none of us make the right choice, the best choice, all of the time. But sometimes with different segments of the population, we have that expectation. Oprah Winfrey said that with each choice is a new beginning, to live the life that we were intended to live. And so to me, the power is in choice, in increasing choice, autonomy, liberation. And that's part of my work, is figuring out how do we increase the choices for people like Paula. Thank you.